Secretary Merrill, I appreciate you being on the show with us today. I'm going to acknowledge the audience, Alabama Care. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a while since we've been here. Today we're going to be talking about the voting process in Alabama and accommodations for people with disabilities. At this point, Secretary Merrill, I'd like to hand it back over and allow you to introduce yourself.
I'm excited to be here with you today. Thank you so much for allowing me to come and to share with your audience about things that are so important to them and to all Alabamians throughout our great state, all 4.8 million of our people. I have been the Alabama Secretary of State for the last 5 years, 9 months, and 7 days, and I'm excited to have the privilege to serve in this capacity, and we want to continue to work hard to ensure that each and every eligible U.S. citizen that's a resident of Alabama has been given the opportunity to become a registered voter and to obtain a photo ID so they can have their voice heard for the candidate of their choice.
Very good. And are you originally from Alabama?
Yes, I was born in Wedowee, which is in Randolph County. I grew up in Heflin, where my mom and dad lived, and stayed there for the first 18 years of my life, and then went to the University of Alabama, and then have been in Tuscaloosa since that time. Cindy and I have our home in Tuscaloosa. We have an apartment in Montgomery where we live during the week when we're down there working, but our home is in Tuscaloosa.
Okay, so it's Roll Tide then.
Roll Tide.
That's always one of my questions.
Yes, sir.
And tell us a little bit about the Secretary of State position and maybe some history there.
Sure.
And duties of yours.
Well, the office of the Secretary of State is the oldest office in the history of the state. Alabama had a Secretary of State before we were a state. In 1818, a man named Henry Hitchcock was appointed by our fifth president, James Monroe, to serve as Alabama's first Secretary of State. Now, he served ably in that role in 1818 and 1819, but on December 14th, 1819, Alabama became the 22nd state admitted to the Union. And since that time, we've had 48 individuals who've served as Alabama's 53 Secretaries of State. Now I'm the 53rd Secretary of State. Our code and constitution give more than 1,000 assigned duties and responsibilities to the person that holds this position. Now those include, but are not limited to, the things that we've concentrated on the most since I've been serving in this capacity, which are elections, which includes voter registration, voter participation, campaign finance reform, campaign finance review, election administration, all the things related to the elections process. And then business incorporations, licensing, trademarking. If you start a new business in our state, you have to go through our office before you can ever hire someone or pay 1 cent of tax. And last but not least, international adoptions. And we want to remove all the red tape whenever a family is trying to add a person to their family to make their family unit whole.
So you guys touch on a lot of different issues
No
there.
doubt.
And we're going to be focusing today on the election, and part of your title is Chief Election Official.
That's correct.
In the state of Alabama. And let's talk a little bit about the history of voting in Alabama, and maybe who some of the first candidates were, or some of the first issues on that, and how we've gotten to today.
Well, obviously, things have changed since Alabama first became a state, and we elected our first governor, our first assistant governor, our first Secretary of State, the positions of the legislature, and all of those things as we moved forward. And Alabama has had a varied past when it comes to voting and voting rights and who should be able to participate in the process. And I've testified before Congress 3 times in the last 18 months. I've been invited 4 times. I was not able to go 1 time. But a lot of times, members of Congress and senators from other states have questions about why Alabama is a voter suppressor or why Alabama keeps certain people from participating. And, you know, I made a commitment when I became the secretary that we were going to ensure that each and every eligible U.S. citizen that's a resident of our state is given the opportunity to become a registered voter and to obtain a photo ID. So we've introduced a number of different ways to make it easier for people to participate in the process. I will tell you that as of today, since January the 19th, 2015, we have registered 1,734,767 new voters in this state. We now have a state record, 3,706,736 registered voters in the state of Alabama. No state in the union has done as much as we've done in that same period of time. Per capita, we've registered more voters, and I'm very, very, very excited about that.
Now, does that new registration come when someone changes counties, or is that?
No, that's not a new
counted?
registration. That's a transfer of a registration.
Transfer, yes.
But you should also know that we've removed more than 1 million people from the voter rolls in that same period of time. And we removed them because following state law, when they've moved away, they've passed away, or they've been put away and lost their right to vote. Whenever those things happen, they need to come off the voter rolls. But 96% of all eligible African Americans are registered to vote in Alabama. 91% of all eligible white Alabamians are registered, and 94% of all eligible Alabamians are registered.
Let's take a quick step back and talk a little bit more about the process of voting in the Electoral College. The Electoral College can kind of be a hot point, especially before and after the election.
Right.
Give us a little bit of history on the Electoral College and some of the plus minuses and why we have it.
Well, the Founding Fathers established the Electoral College as a way to make sure that the large states' voices were not heard greater than the smaller states in the Union at that time. For example, Virginia, which was our largest state, and North Carolina, which was also a large state, Massachusetts, which was a large state population-wise, were so much greater than Delaware and New Hampshire and Rhode Island that they did not want their voices to be drowned out. So they devised a system where each state got 2 votes based on their 2 United States senators that represented them in the Congress. Now, at the time, those senators were appointed by the state legislatures. But the other Electoral College vote was established based on the number of people who lived in your state. So you had an assigned member of Congress or more members of Congress. So you added that number to the 2, and every state had at least 3. Some had more than that, but that's the way it was determined how many states would receive how many electoral votes.
Yeah, because you don't want 2 big states or 3 big states in the U.S. controlling what goes on.
Which is what you would even have today with New York, Illinois, Texas, Florida, California. Those states alone could elect a president if you did it by popular vote.
And that's why we have the Electoral College there. A question that kind of makes sense for us, how does my ballot, when I fill it out at the polling station, how does my ballot end up on TV later that night? What is
Well,
the process?
that's a great question. The way the process works is you go to one of the 1,980 polling sites that you're assigned to vote at. When you arrive, you show them your photo ID. When you show them your photo ID, when you get to the front of the line, now we have electronic poll books in 63 of the 67 counties. So instead of you having to wait in line for your letter to be called and you to be able to move up, you go to the shortest line. They scan your ID, it pulls up your image, it shows them who you are. You sign in with a stylus pen where we can match your signature against the one that's on file with the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency. Once they've confirmed that they know who you are, you've signed in, it's been authenticated, then you will be given a ballot. And once you've given a ballot, you'll go to another location, you'll sit down, you'll complete the ballot, you'll turn the ballot in to the tabulator, which is also called the voting machine. That's what most people refer to it as. You'll stick it in there, it digitally reads your ballot because as you bubbled in the marks, it lets them know who you voted for. Then they give you your I voted sticker, then you go on your way. Now your ballot is retained in that voting box, in that tabulator. And then once the election's over, it's secured for at least a 2-year period of time that it's held in abeyance. And then that night, when all the other polling precincts in your county report their votes to the probate judge at that central location, that thumb drive that was recording those votes, after it's been printed out at the location where you voted, because I don't know if you've ever seen this or not, but you can go the next day, you can go that night at 7, or you can go the next day, and you can see what the results were in each one of those boxes in each place where you vote at your location. If there's 3 tabulators, there'll be 3 reports. If there's 1, there'll be 1 report.
So anybody can do that. Any
Absolutely.
resident of the state of Alabama can
That's
do
right.
that. And why is it important to vote?
Well, it's important to vote because if you don't vote, then your voice is not going to be heard. And if your vote's not counted for the candidate of your choice, then you have no representation. You only have the representation that's provided by the winning candidate. And if that's not your candidate, that's not going to be very helpful to you.
Yeah, as my grandfather said, if you don't vote, you can't complain.
Right.
You got no dog in the fight there. And what are the ways that people can vote?
Well, you can vote by going to your polling site and voting in person on the day of the election, or you can vote through the absentee process. And the absentee process begins 55 days before the election. So this year it was September the 9th. So between September the 9th and October 29th, which is this coming Thursday, you can cast your ballot by making an application for an absentee ballot.
So even if someone today doesn't have that, they can still request it
Absolutely.
in the next few days.
You can do it in person at the circuit clerk's office in your county, or you can do it by mail. The last day for the absentee ballot application to be received is Thursday, close of business, October 29th.
Has to be received, not postmarked
That's
received.
correct. That's correct. And then your ballot must be returned no later than November the 2nd, close of business, if you're returning it in person. If you're returning it by mail, it must be received by mail no later than noon on election day.
So we have, you can vote in person at your voting station that you've been assigned, and you can do absentee ballot sending in.
That's correct.
There have been some issues recently.
Now, let me say this before we leave the absentee process.
Yes, sir.
In Alabama, we are an absentee excuse state, which means that the voter must indicate why they're voting absentee. And what I did, because we're in a time of declared state of emergency, is I invoked Title 17-11-3, which gives me the authority as the Secretary of State to indicate to you and all of our registered voters in the state why they should choose a particular box to vote absentee. And we selected the box that says, I'm ill or infirmed and unable to appear at my polling site on election day. That's the number 2 excuse on the form. You mark the similar box that's on the affidavit envelope, and then you are qualified as an absentee voter in our state, regardless of your reason.
Tell us, what are some of the other reasons that you could have an absentee ballot?
I'm going to be out of town. I'm away in school. I'm incarcerated. I'm out of the country. There's about 10 different reasons that are on that list.
Okay. One of the things...
And let me say this, you can get the absentee ballot application on your computer, downloading it in a fillable PDF at alabamavotes.gov.
One of the things that people with disabilities have a little trouble is getting around and out, especially right now. And some of the things that are required for that absentee ballot have been at the forefront, whether that's getting an ID or having witnesses or a notary, and even issues such as getting a printer. What would you say about some of those things that people in the community feel are limiting for them?
Well, those people are entitled to their own opinion. To say that it's limiting their access or their ability to participate, they're entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. Well, what are the facts? The facts are that each and every eligible voter, all 3,706,736 registered voters, have had since September 9th to have some accommodation made for them, whether it's to hand deliver them an absentee ballot application, whether it's to have that individual transported to the absentee election manager, the circuit clerk's office, whatever it happened to be. In order to get that done, we've had 2 months for it to happen. And as of today, we've had 271,000 absentee ballot applications successfully submitted, and we've had 206,000 absentee ballots successfully cast as of today. The previous record in any election cycle in the history of the state was 89,000 over the full period of time. We still have a week left.
Yeah.
We're probably going to be north of 300,000 successful absentee ballots successfully submitted. So it's disappointing when people wait till the last moment and then they feel like they're not being able to have their voice heard. But there's been 2 months, and we've been running commercials for 2 months, and we've been sharing the word for a lot longer than 2 months to make sure people knew this option was there.
Kind of with the trend there, absentee ballot, mail-in voting, do you see that going up in the future?
Well, there's a different conversation when you're talking about mail-in voting. Now, we have absentee voting by mail, and then there's another process called universal vote by mail, or as President Trump has recently started referring to it as unsolicited voting by mail. Now, what that means is that in universal vote by mail or unsolicited vote by mail, whatever you want to call it, is that in that state where that's offered, every voter receives a ballot mailed to their location, whether they requested it or not, whether they intend to vote or not. But in our state, the only people that get one mailed to them are the people that actually requested it and then made sure that they did so through a formal application process. There's 5 states in the union that use universal vote by mail: Hawaii, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. The 3 states that do it the best are Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. Now, the secretaries in those states will tell you that to initiate the process to have universal vote by mail, you should be at a 60% return by mail clip before you ever start the conversation. Alabama's at 4%. That's typically been our regular experience with voting by mail. This
Why
year,
do you think it's
it'll
so
be
low
higher.
compared?
People like to vote in person in our state. That's something that they've always enjoyed doing, and it's something they continue to do. The second thing that they'll tell you is that if you initiate universal vote by mail, you should have a 5-year implementation plan, because it will take you 5 years to successfully implement universal vote by mail. Not 5 months, like some of my colleagues are trying to do in certain states, but 5 years. And last but not least, something that I haven't heard anybody talk about except me, and I introduced this to Anderson Cooper on AC 360 about a month ago when he was interviewing me one day on CNN, and he asked me a question about universal vote by mail, and I explained to him that in Alabama, it cost us $6.5 million per election segment, $5.5 million per election segment in order to administer the election. So a segment is the primary, a segment is the runoff, a segment is the general. So the 3 segments combined would be $16.5 million for the full election cycle. One election segment with universal vote by mail is $18.5 million. So the difference in the process would be $16.5 million with the way we're currently doing it, or $60 million if you did it with universal vote by mail.
Do you think it will go that route in the future? Do you
I
think
think
we'll have
the discussion will occur in the Alabama legislature. I don't know that the legislature will be supportive of that, but anytime you have an election, I think you always need to address things that are necessary to be addressed by the members of the legislature to determine what changes need to occur to make the process go even smoother than it did the time before.
And I'm inclined to ask why the difference between 18 and 5.5?
Well, because when you have universal vote by mail, you're producing a lot more ballots, you're producing a lot more security mechanisms that need to be put in place. You are mailing a ballot to everyone. You are having return mail from everyone back to the point of origin. There's just a number of factors that have to be included whenever you're talking about that return process as well as the solicitation process, and it costs significantly more.
Do you feel like the number of Alabamians that vote would increase with that?
Well, I'll say this. The states, usually I get that question when people ask me about early in-person voting.
Yeah.
And people say, why are you opposed to early in-person voting? Well, because in every state in the union that has had early in-person voting prior to this election cycle, 2 things have been in common. Number one is the number of people who vote does not increase. It just spreads out the period of time in which the same number of people are voting.
That's what they've seen so
That's
far.
what we've seen. That's what the empirical data shows. The other thing is that in every instance where states have early in-person voting, the cost has increased. So if you're increasing the cost for everyone, but it's only
It's not
providing
giving you
convenience
results.
for a few,
Yeah.
why should you do it?
I could understand if you were having much greater numbers or
Right.
Stuff like that.
Right.
Are you open, if you see that data in the future, to doing some of those things?
And that's why I said every time you have an election, you need to revisit the administration of the election to see what things you need to consider changing.
Another thing I'd like to talk about is the curbside voting. That's kind of been a hot topic as well. If you could give the audience a little history about that and what that is.
Sure. The first time the term curbside voting was ever introduced to me was in April of 2016 when I was in San Diego, California. And I heard some of their election officials talking about curbside voting, and I was like, what is curbside voting? And they explained to me that that meant that when someone would pull up to a polling site and blow the horn, somebody would come outside and greet them and give them the sign-up sheet, which would be the poll book or the electronic poll book. Someone would bring them a ballot so they could complete their ballot. Somebody would take their ballot back in, turn it into the tabulator, and then that would be their voting experience. Now, I have a real problem with that, especially the way it was presented to me, because you lose chain of custody. Now, somebody may be out there and say, what is chain of custody? Well, chain of custody is when you check in at your polling site, like we talked about earlier, when you go to vote in person on November the 3rd, they will check you in, and after they check you in, they will give you your ballot. The next time your ballot is touched is by the machine where you fed it in so that your vote could be counted for the candidate of your choice. And if you have allowed someone else to touch your ballot, you've lost chain of custody. And so that person could change your vote, they could change your vote on an amendment for a candidate or any other thing that was important to them. And so this prevents that from actually occurring when you don't lose chain of custody. Now, the people that have asked me, why are you opposed to curbside voting? Well, it's not permitted by Alabama law. It's not an option that's available for voters in the state of Alabama. The first time that I was aware that it was being offered was in 2016 in the presidential election. About 8:15 that morning, my phone rang. Somebody said, did you know they're letting curbside voting take place in this particular county? And I said, no, I wasn't aware of that. He said, well, I witnessed it myself. So I hung up the phone with him and I called the probate judge and I reported to him what had been reported to me. And I said, is this something that's going on? And he said, yes. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. I said, under what authority granted to you in the Alabama Code or Constitution are you allowed to permit curbside voting? And he said, well, it's just something we do as a convenience for our voters. And I said, that's not what I asked you. Under what authority granted to you in the codes of the Constitution are you able to permit curbside voting in your county? And he said, there's no law that I'm aware of. And I said, then I'm assuming that you're going to cease and desist on this right now. I said, now, if you need me to call the sheriff, and I called his name, to help make sure that this is shut down, I'll be happy to do so. And he said, no, it won't be necessary. Well, that ended it. But then it came up in this lawsuit this time, which was introduced back in the summer for the July 14th runoff. Then it was introduced again for the November 3rd general election. Fortunately, both times the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the people of Alabama by not allowing something that is outside the scope and boundary or the spirit of the laws in our state, and so it is prohibited.
Now, is there a law that says it's not allowed? You're not allowed to do curbside?
No, it's not a law that says that it's not allowed, and there's not a law that allows it. It is not permitted because it's not specifically delineated that that is an option that's available. But I can tell you this, at the end of the legislative session in 2021, there'll be a law that says... I was going to
ask if you were going to push for that.
We're going to make sure a law is passed that will say that that is prohibited in the state of Alabama.
So the real thing against curbside, you're saying, is the break in the chain of that ballot.
That's correct.
Why not just put the machine right next to the curbside like you would...
Has it ever rained on you on election day?
Well, I go to the bank and I have an overhead at the bank that I can still make transactions.
Well, it's at a permanent location provided by a private institution.
Yeah.
Have you ever voted on election day in the rain? If you haven't, you will. And these machines are not designed for outside use. They're designed to be in a controlled environment to enable the voter to make sure when they put their ballot in that it's received, and then that takes care of it for that voter. Now, if you want the convenience of voting in a way other than getting out of your vehicle on election day, you got 2 months to do it before the election through absentee. Mm-hmm. You can actually vote at your home and never leave your house.
You need to plan ahead for that, and that's what I feel like you're saying to the audience is, we're not going to allow these, especially this time, and I don't see it in the future where you're going to be doing curbside.
Well, and look, this is another thing to remember. People are complaining now that they're going to vote and they're waiting an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to get in and vote. Well, I voted the second week of September and it took me 8 minutes. So poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on anyone else's part.
Do you ever see a future where there could be curbside voting?
Not as long as I'm Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm. What are some other accommodations for people that have a disability when they go to in-person voting?
Sure. All of our locations, all 1,980 polling sites in the state of Alabama are ADA accessible and have been approved for ADA accessibility. We want to ensure that every voter that wants to vote, whether or not they have considerations because of physical infirmities, if they have mental health issues, if they need assistance, they ought to be able to vote independently. at their location of their choice, which is either the absentee election manager's office or their polling place where they've been assigned to vote. So there is a piece of equipment, an automark machine, that's set up at each one of those places for that voter to be able to vote on their own independently of anyone else assisting them.
You've done some work also with low vision, deaf and blind.
We have.
So talk a little bit
That's
about
very
that.
important to me, and we have a great relationship with the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and the Blind, ensuring that our blind, low vision, or sight impaired voters are able to vote the way they want to. One of the things we even explored with Dr. Massia and the leadership at AIDB and the leadership at the National Federation for the Blind this year was creating a Braille ballot for each and every blind, low vision, sight impaired voter to send to them personally that would be just their ballot. We actually did a survey to determine what is the way that most people would like to vote that fall into those categories. And the thing that we discovered is they really would rather go to their polling site and make sure that when they arrive, they're able to cast their ballot independently. So that's what we've been working toward.
And tell us a little bit about, I know you've done some community outreach, speaking to leaders in the community. Are there places that I should visit this year? Or, who should I get in touch with to better understand my constituents?
Right, and we continue to do that. This is the 9th time in the 8th year in a row that I've been to all 67 counties. As of today, I've been to 56 of the 67 counties for 299 unique visits to those locations. Now, I'll make the other 11 counties before December 31st is on us, but I don't know a better way to stay in touch with our people, to listen to them, to see what their needs are, than by interacting with them and seeing what their needs are. So I'm always excited to get out and visit with our folks.
Give us a few examples of some upcoming trips or areas that you're going to
Well,
visit.
actually, I'll be in Morgan County later this week, going to visit with some people in Decatur, a community group and a business that wanted me to come by and tour their facility and meet their employees and see what they're doing. I'm speaking to a group of ladies tomorrow down in Baldwin County that will be meeting at lunch in Fairhope. Next week, I'll be going back down there to speak to a group in Foley. I'll be going to Huntsville on Friday night of this week for an event. So I have places all over the state that I'm going to, from the Tennessee Valley to the Wiregrass, from the Shoals down to Mobile. So I'm just wherever people will invite me to go, in some places where they don't.
Now, I'll say I'm not a fan of driving, so I hope you have somebody to break that up with you.
A lot of times I do, and that's always very helpful.
Another thing I've heard is a van that has been in the community getting people to register to vote.
Well, actually, it's not a particular type of vehicle. It's what we call our mobile unit. And a lot of people think it is just a van that's dedicated for that purpose, but we have a couple of vehicles that are a part of the team there at the Office of the Secretary of State, and those vehicles are in our fleet, and we are able to put the mobile ID unit in there, put the cards and materials that are necessary in order to process those applications, and to send it to all 67 counties, which we do at least one time every year. We always make over 100 visits annually in different parts of our state to make sure that people are registered to vote and are able to obtain a photo ID.
I think that's a really good idea to get people thinking about it, even if they don't utilize that service, kind of implement
Yes, and
that
that's
idea.
not something that's prescribed by law. It's something that we do because we think it's good customer service.
Now, there are, I don't know the correct name, but poll helpers, people that will assist at the polls for voters, stuff like that. What is that official title?
Well,
for
we
that?
have poll workers that are there. We have the inspector, then we have the poll captains, we have poll workers who are there to make sure that everyone's voting experience is what it needs to be. And we have poll watchers that are there that work for candidates in the primary setting or work for parties in the general election. So a Democrat, a Republican can be there to observe all the things that go on that particular day.
Are there any qualifications that they need, or how would one become?
No, they just need to to be a poll worker, you need to contact your circuit clerk. They have a training school where they train everyone to make sure they're fully prepared to go, and then they're compensated when they work on election day. They get paid for the training as well as for their work. The poll watchers are people that are assigned by the parties to go there those individuals in some instances are also compensated, but they go and they observe. They cannot interact with the voters.
So if somebody in the audience, somebody with a disability was looking to get more involved in voting, election, sounds like poll worker might be a great opportunity
Absolutely.
to kind of...
We'd love to see them in that role.
Yeah. And what are some of the upcoming deadlines specifically about the presidential election?
Well, of course, the last day to register to vote was October the 19th. So it's already passed. You can't change your voter registration record, your location, or register for the first time. But the last day to register for an absentee ballot application is October the 29th, which is coming up this Thursday. Close of business, the application has to be received. The absentee ballot has to be returned if in person no later than close of business on November the 2nd. And if by mail, it must be received by the absentee election manager by noon on election day.
So there, you guys are hearing the deadlines, so make sure you're on top of those.
That's right. And of course, the polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on election day. And if you're in line at 7 p.m. to get into your polling site, but the line is really long, don't worry, you'll still be allowed to vote even though it may be 8, 8:30, 9 o'clock.
So you're not turning anyone away at 7 o'clock?
No.
Now, are there some accommodations? My grandmother is a little bit older, in her 80s, and she's worried about getting there and there being a line and having to stand. She can't stand for very
If
long.
she's 70 years older, and you said she was in her 80s, she can go to the front of the line once she arrives at her polling site. She can indicate to a poll worker that she is 70 years of age and she can't stand up or wait in line. She'll be escorted to the front of the line.
Now, is that just for that age
No,
group?
that's state law for anyone 70 or older.
Is there any other accommodations there for people with a disability that they can go to the front of the line?
None that has been introduced that I'm aware of that's in the code.
Okay.
Is there a specific example that you may be thinking about?
No, I was just thinking if this is available for my grandmother, it would be great if somebody, had that opportunity that maybe wasn't that age group, but had some
Right.
of the disabilities that my grandmother has. That would be nice for them as well. When is the next vote after this presidential election?
Well, the next vote will take place in, and there's some special elections that will be coming up just for certain legislative districts across the state. But the next vote will be a municipal vote in March of next year for certain municipalities around the state of Alabama. The next time we'll have a statewide vote will be in May of 2022.
May of 2022.
That's when we'll elect a governor again, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, legislature, sheriffs.
I notice that every time I go through a process, there's always things to fine tune. What are some of the things that you guys are seeing that you might want to fine tune for that next big election?
Well, the thing that we have to do is to sit down with the leaders in the election area, the probate judge, the sheriff, the circuit clerk, the registrars. Talk to them. What have you seen? What did you note? What do you think might need to be changed to make the process more efficient or more effective than it's been before? Then get with legislators, ask them, what do you think we need to do in order to make this a better process than it's been before? And then see what we can work together on to pass into new laws that will enable everyone to have a more successful experience the next election.
Is there anything that's popping up right now for you guys?
There are some things that are on the table that have been introduced, but most notably that you've already introduced to me today is curbside voting and a ban on curbside voting to make sure that it is prohibited in the state of Alabama.
And are there any upcoming events besides the election coming next Tuesday? Any upcoming events that you would like to highlight and just encourage the community to engage with?
You know, we don't have anything that we've got scheduled in our office with the exception of the Electoral College Day, which is when our votes will be certified for the presidency. Our Electoral College delegates will actually meet on the 14th of December at the state capitol, and at that point we'll have those individuals come together. They'll sign the certificate indicating to Vice President Pence who the winner was, indicating to Speaker Pelosi who the winner was, indicating to the curator at the Department of Archives in Washington who the winner was, and then we will forward those certificates to those individuals so that those will be retained for posterity.
Okay. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think the audience, specifically the disability community in Alabama, would really benefit from hearing?
You know, nothing that I can think of except to share this. I always want your audience to know that they have an advocate in the Office of the Secretary of State or whatever position I may be privileged to hold in the future. My father was an amputee. He also spent his last years in a wheelchair. And even in spite of the fact he'd had a very successful career as an elected official when I was growing up, I'm always cognizant of things that are important to those individuals who have physical infirmities, especially because of the time that I was able to spend with him during the first 55 years of my life when he was actually still living, and I got to see the challenges that he had. So I think they need to know that I'm always there for them. I'm always interested in what they've got to say. If they'd like to reach out to me, they can do so at our office at 334-242-7200, or they can call me on my cell phone at 334-328-2787, 334-328-2787. I'd be delighted to help them solve whatever problem is there in front of them.
Well, Secretary Merrill, I want to thank you for your time today and coming. And I know that the audience has enjoyed this broadcast, and we're all kind of, it's a buzz right now with the election, so we're all kind of wrapped up in it, and we'll see how Tuesday comes out.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me as your guest.
Yep. And at this point, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast, and we'll see you guys later this week.